The next segment is the Ngee Kongsi-IPS Community Fellows. Thanks to a generous donation from the Ngee Kongsi, we're now able to appoint and award 2 community fellowships per year. And so these are, I'll tell you a bit about what it is and why. These are fellowships that, so the community fellows will become adjunct research fellows in IPS, and they receive a stipend for their work here, but it will be a part-time stint. And this is because through consultation with people who do community work, we realize that if you're a social worker or you're a community worker, you can't afford time away from your organization. So it would have to be something that you do on the side. So this fellowship allows us to create some bandwidth for people like Biling and Ansu to come and do this while continuing their work in their nonprofits. And the kind of projects that can be done, it can either be a community-based participatory research project, which is working with communities to understand the needs or challenges they face, and then to co-create solutions together with the communities. So that's more like a kind of blank slate approach. Let's work with the communities that you're part of to see what works. Or it can also be something of implementing a concept or solution that you already have in mind. And that's a little bit of what Ansu is doing. So Ansu is working with Beyond Social Services to create a kind of worker-owned social enterprise. These are women from low-income families who are sewing and baking. And his job is to try to support them in coming together to make collective decisions and on how to run a viable and sustainable business together. The reason why we wanted to do this also is because this the logic of community development is little understood. And so Minister Desmond Lee talked about focusing on the strengths and assets of families and communities themselves instead of focusing on leaders. And I think Biling will talk a bit about that. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, which I think is great, because if you're doing asset-based community development work, the usual kind of principles don't necessarily apply here. It's not necessarily scale up a service model. Sometimes small is beautiful. They talk about not scaling up, but scaling across. And it's not the logic of replication, but the logic of emulation. And I think about what Minister Desmond also mentioned about community circles. We had community circles UK come share at a learning journey. So these guys have set up an organization and they provide do-it-yourself kits. Anybody who wants to start a circle can go to their website and download stuff, and you can immediately start a circle on your own. And he said, you know, this is a really bad business model because they do all this and it's all free. It's a bad business model because you don't earn money from it. In fact, it's a bad service model because, you know, you're giving away what you're doing to others. But it really makes a lot of sense if you're thinking about contributing to the commons, right? You're contributing to the collective good without worry about profit or competitive advantage. And so I think through these efforts, we'll be able to understand a bit more of this. And first we'll have Ms. Ng Biling, the Director of Community Development and Corporate Support from ANKFSC, come share with us. Over to you, Biling.
Thank you, Justin. Let me get the slides on the screen. Thank you for this deep privilege of being a community fellow. It is both an honor as well as a quandary for me, to be very honest. Allow me to elaborate with a little story. Many years back, when I was just starting out, social worker, I loved walking in the community, especially when it became a familiar presence in the rental neighborhoods that I frequented. And at that time, neighbors knew neighbors. And of course, we know all the good and the bad. And the doors to all the flats were often kept open. It didn't feel like work to me, as children in the playground would run to me and greet me and say, "Auntie Biling," in chorus, as I approached the housing blocks. Then words would soon get around as I visited their homes, and heads would pop out of their flats, and shouting across the corridor, you could hear someone saying, "Hey, Biling, later you come my house, today I cook mee goreng." We would partake in meals while chatting about the going-ons in the neighborhood, who was getting married, who was in hospital, who has got a new baby, who has just got out of jail, who had a misunderstanding with who was helping who with what, and when is their next community get-together would be, etc., etc. So much to share and never a dull conversation. Chinese New Year and Mooncake Festival were feasts to the eyes, as children of all ethnicities will be carrying lanterns and lighting candles around their neighborhoods. Ray Wangs and Hari Raya were my favorite, as I got invited alongside other neighbors to homes and void decks to partake in their wonderful meals put together by the whole village, so to speak. In the process, stories were exchanged and tears and joys were shared. Then I would hear about how Siti's baby had arrived prematurely and how Noli was helping to jaga and bring Siti's kids to school for the 3 days that their mom was in hospital after a C-section. How Cik Muna, who was almost 80 years old, would cook meals for the children, and how Uncle Peng helped with marketing and collecting food rations on Siti's behalf. The community met often at each other's homes or at their void decks, for evening chit-chats, for weddings, for funerals, or simply to conjure up the next community get-together. In case I have painted you a neighborhood which is like a paradise, let me clarify that this was a neighborhood of many problems too. But people here, though limited in material means, would share generously when they come together, and the net experience is that of an abundant community. They didn't need a framework called asset-based community development or any other framework, and certainly had no jargons, right, to describe community building that they did naturally. There was strong community ownership and trust and friendships among residents, and mutual aid was natural. Then I took a 7-year hiatus from the neighborhood as I got transferred from groundwork to head an organization, and also took a 4-year break from my young children as a full-time mom. Upon returning 7 years later, I saw that the neighborhood was so much greener and prettier, and many social services had also set up shop at the void decks. The playground was more colorful and better equipped, but missing were the children's screams and laughters. The simple round marble table in front of the childcare center was now replaced by a beautifully landscaped mini garden. But the familiar banter of parents and grandparents waiting to pick up their kids was sorely missing. The doors to their homes were now mostly shut, and the buzz along the corridor was no longer discernible. There were still some familiar faces here and there. They told me some had moved out, some had passed on, and new residents had moved in, but people now kept mostly to themselves. Many say they were thankful for the social services closer to their homes to help them, but they no longer trust or turn to their neighbors in times of distress. Residents who have lived there longer reminisce the good old times, and they still desire to rekindle the kampong spirit, but felt no longer able to do it organically anymore without support and resources from professionals and organizations. So what has transpired within the 7 years, such that residents began to lose their sense of agency and collective action? As a community work professional myself, I'm excited, like many of you, about knowledge building and curating practice wisdom, about codifying learning among fellow practitioners. But deep inside me, I also sense a growing despair with regards to the growing professionalization of community work. As professionals get competent and organized, will we unwittingly assert the power and ownership of the very people at the center, i.e. the residents and everyday community members? History tells us that this can happen. As paid professionals doing this full-time, backed by resources of organizations we come from, and coupled with our power and privilege, how do we make sure that we do not end up taking over, despite professing to the contrary? After all, isn't it that results are faster when we take over, especially when hard-pressed by funder to prove effectiveness? Today, we are a gathering of professionals, researchers, social sector leaders, and policymakers grappling with the issue of measuring and evaluating, and in my case, about community work. As a professional, I'm intrigued by citizen-led community development, leaning mostly towards asset-based community development, or ABCD in short. This image guides me as I think about community development. As community workers, we aspire for decision-making to shift more and more towards the right as citizens step up collectively to own and co-create community well-being. Therefore, from an evaluation point of view, in terms of process, I have the following curiosities with regards to community building. Who decides what will be done? Who are the producers of what results? Are they done by the citizens, or are they done or provided by professionals, or is it a collaboration between the two? How do everyday residents or citizens discover and mobilize each other's strengths and motivations? How do citizen-led or community-owned initiatives get started in the first place? And what sustained these initiatives? What kept them going? What works? For whom? When? What didn't work? In terms of outcomes, I guess the important question to remind myself is outcomes for who and determined by who. Often it is funder or organization determined, which is good for institutional accountability, but it serves well top-down when we are anchored on outcomes that matters most from grounds up. The question is, are we able to hold the space so that citizens' voice prevails? So outcome question, important one for me will be, what matters most to the community as good outcomes? So what do? You have to go and find out. This sounds like pretty good questions for a community fellow like me to start off with, isn't it? But I have to ask myself honestly, how many of these questions will likely matter to the everyday citizens? For example, the uncles and aunties who live community, as much as they do for professionals like me, who make a living conceiving community. More importantly, how do we make sure that the knowledge we built does not colonize the everyday world of everyday members of the community by making what is natural complicated, such that the community feels overawed, losing their sense of efficacy and agency, and become even more reliant on professionals. So I came up with a kind of framework to keep myself in check. I want to remind myself that instead of seeing professionals as experts, to remember that citizens have local knowledge and lived experience as their expertise too. Instead of starting with professional and research expertise, I want to start with strengths and resources that the citizens have. Instead of asking research questions, perhaps it's important to go to the community and ask, what are they curious to find out about? And instead of research design with surveys, quantitative analysis, can we also give value to conversations and stories? Instead of using professional formal language that can intimidate and alienate, can we use everyday informal language? Instead of it being researcher-led, can we look at community-based participatory research? Instead of seeing these as findings, can we look at it as a process of co-learning and discovering? So in this way, I hope to still measure what the community treasures. Before putting communities under the microscope, I think another important question is, what climate or environment does community need to create outcomes that they treasure? I find this cartoon very enlightening and apt in describing not just our climate crisis, but also our state of community building. Community building to me is akin to tree planting. It takes years to sow the seeds, plant the saplings, nurture the growth before they bear fruits. And they're so critical to our ecosystem. And their absence is so devastating to our human existence. It is so easy to cut them down for short-term gains. Similar to tree cutting, our social connections has been cut or weakened over time by our busy modern lifestyles that prioritize material gains. the effects of which are manifesting itself in the forms of social isolation, poor mental health, and complex social problems, which can escalate quickly without the buffer of natural networks of neighbors, friends, and associates. As professionals, we tend to focus on the deficits and problems. Like Minister said, sometimes we forget to look at the assets and strengths that people have. And we often take on the psychosocial or microsystem lens to analyze and find solutions. Often we do not pay enough attention to the meso and macro systems, the impact of the larger environment on our well-being. What needs to happen or change in the big environment or climate to encourage community building? I'm thus very heartened to see sections in this conference that I believe will look not just at practice, but also policies and macro factors. In my humble opinion, to restore and enable community building, the following social conditions are important ingredients. First, communities are built at a pace of trust. Authentic community building needs time to strike roots and bear sustainable fruits. Hence, funding and evaluation need to have a longer time orientation instead of looking for quick short-term results. To encourage fledgling communities to flourish, good enough accountability and light touch evaluation should surface. Ample trust and space have to be given to encourage experimentation, innovation, and learning. Give community building a chance. Second, for a climate that encourages community building, we need a social compact where institutions and the state play a catalytic role by enabling, rewarding, aggregating, and funding community initiatives instead of overreaching or overregulating. Likewise, citizens must step up and claim the space to collaborate, contribute, and shape. Build and earn trust and mutual accountability through working together at the local levels, resolving conflicts and learning from failures and successes. Collectively, we can build a society where communities are like homes, where helping a neighbor or a stranger is as natural as helping a family member. Thirdly, failures are necessary. We learn wisdom and humility from things that do not work. This sounds like such a cliche, but for a society that prides ourselves on success and efficiency, it is important to remind ourselves to trust and give collective wisdom a chance instead of stepping in too quickly to problem solve and fix things when they are seemingly not working. Communities need time and space to learn and build our muscles to norm, to flop and storm, or what I call flom, before we can perform. I believe the above social conditions are necessary to create space for communities in Singapore to grow and thrive alongside social services. Services by professionals and community development both have their important place in an ecosystem of care. One needs the other. While professionals and the state play important roles in social care, we need to be mindful that we are not taking over in areas where communities can do well. To prevent overreach and also to encourage active citizenry, perhaps the discipline of what I call the do no harm questions may help. Question 1 of do no harm often start with what the residents do well on their own, the buy space, before moving on to question 2, which is what can residents do well with some help from us, the with space, before finally going to the third question of what do they need institutions to do for them. What is important here is the sequencing of the questions. Often we start with question 3 instead of finding out first what residents can do well on their own. In instances where residents are doing well by residents for residents, we need to step back so that space is created for community to step up. In instances where residents do better working alongside professionals, we offer and support with expertise and resources that they need. And of course, there will be areas that the community will need institutions and the state to do for them. This is the space where social services and policies can play important roles. The importance here is to start with question 1 as a discipline. If it's true that when the state and professionals step up too much, the community will step back and become reliant, will the community step up if we step back? I think that is the nagging question some people would ask. Do we trust that the community is ready and capable of stepping up? When COVID-19 hit our shops and circuit breaker had to be put in place, social services were disrupted and withdrawn at a time when needs were high. The lockdown and restrictions that were necessary rendered it very hard for the much needed services to get to those in need. However, when social services had to step back, what do we see happening spontaneously to fill those cracks? What was most heartening for me to behold was how the informal social networks of the community step up organically to fill the space. I'm sure many of you can still recall the numerous grounds up initiatives where ordinary citizens mobilized food, sanitizers, masks, tablets and laptops, and other essentials for the community, by the community. Sometimes I wonder, if instead of growing more and more social services, which we are finding it increasingly hard to sustain, will we do better to use the money to support and fund grounds up community initiatives instead? Let's pause for a moment to consider these possibilities. When I last went back to the rental neighborhood that taught me community so many years ago, I'm so heartened that all is not lost. Some of the mischievous kids I grew old with are now parents and community leaders in their own right. They showed me the tenacity of their kampong spirit, and it gives me hope to see them painstakingly planting trees of community connections within their neighborhoods. Thank you, community, for keeping me going. Thank you.
Thank you, Biling. Thanks for always reminding us there's the uncles and aunties on the ground that should own their problems and do what they can. And I think one of the rare things about Biling is that she safeguards the community even against her own professional self-interest, right? And the other thing that struck me was the picture with the koala bear. I think it's such a perfect encapsulation of how when we look at problems, there's this almost instinct to look at the problem in isolation. This koala bear is suffering, has mental health issues. Maybe we should make the koala bear more resilient. But actually, the forest has been cut down, and it's if we individualize what is a social problem, that's where we get at. And Biling says she's honored to take on this community fellowship. But in my chats with her, I said, Biling, if you take this community fellowship, you will be doing us a favor because of there are very few people, veteran community workers around in Singapore who know as much as she does, and she's kindly accepted the fellowship and done us all a favor by doing this work. Next, I would like to invite Lian Su. So all the bios of the speakers and discussants is in the conference package and you can read them. But the way I would describe Ansu is that he's a filmmaker, philosopher, and businessman. He's a polymath of sorts. Unlike me, I'm a dabbler. I do many things and do many things badly. Ansu do many things and do many things well. So over to you, Ansu.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks for saving me the trouble of describing myself, because I always find it tough to describe what I do. It's such an honor to be here. And, I have this wonderful opportunity over the next year to work with Beyond Social Services as a community fellow, helping them build their workers' cooperative. And one of the things that I'll be trying to focus on is how to introduce like a governance system, a way that the members can make decisions among themselves. And the system that we'll be trying out is something called Sociocracy. Now, what is Sociocracy? It's a system that was developed by a Dutch engineer, Gerard Endenburg, in the 1970s. And he based it on engineering principles and cybernetics and other aspects of 20th century science. And it's basically a way of where workers or members can democratically make decisions in a circle. So everyone in a circle has equivalence, everyone has an equal voice, and they do rounds so that everyone's voice is heard. And there are roles, there is hierarchy of skills and talents, but everyone has the ability to object to something that negatively impacts their work. And what is a worker co-op? A worker co-op is a kind of business where you remove the distinction or the conflict of interest between owners and workers so that the workers themselves benefit from all the fruits of their labor. So how did I come across my interest in sociocracy and worker co-ops? About 2 years ago, my younger brother died suddenly, and he was the owner and chef of the Coconut Club restaurant. So overnight, I was handed the responsibility of this restaurant business. Now, I never had any interest in running an F&B business. So very quickly, I decided that I wanted to give the business to the staff. And my brother, he treated his staff like family. One of the things that we have in common is a passion for trying to address all the social inequality that we see around us. He had a very liberal hiring policy, so he hired ex-offenders, single moms, people who other F&B outlets would reject, and he actually trained and nurtured them into a team that eventually won Michelin Bib Gourmand. So I had no qualms about the idea of trying to hand them the business, but I was concerned that I wanted to also give them a method of making decisions on their own. And so when I did some research, that's where I came across Sociocracy. For instance, there was a bakery in Oregon that was using it, and it's called Blue Scotcher Cafe. And if you go to the website, they have a wonderful description of Sociocracy. And the more I learned and researched about Sociocracy, I became so obsessed with it and interested in it. I thought, wow, okay, this actually is the solution, not just to how you run businesses, but even whole communities. And I started talking about it to everyone. And that's how I started talking to it about with Justin from IPS about it and Gerard from Beyond. And one thing led to another, and here I am. Justin invited me to apply for the community fellowship. Just to bookend the Coconut Club part of the story, I tried to implement Sociocracy and turn it into workers' co-op, but for a variety of reasons, I did not succeed. One of them being the challenges of running an F&B business during a pandemic. And in the end, I decided it was best actually for the staff and for myself if we sold the business to like a proper restaurant operator with enough experience and welfare for the staff that they would look after them and also be able to honor my brother's legacy. But my passion for sociocracy and worker co-ops have continued. So where does my interest in exploring these aspects of human cooperation come from? I'd like to bring in some a phase from my earlier life. Justin mentioned that I've been a filmmaker. So in my 20s and 30s, I was based in San Francisco and I had a film production company. And my first film was a documentary on Burning Man. And for those of you who don't know, Burning Man is a festival that takes place once a year. Actually, festival is not really a great way to describe it. It's hard to describe it. It's a experiment in building a temporary city. So 70,000 to 100,000 people build a temporary city in the middle of a desert. And for 1 week, they express themselves in all kinds of different ways and really just experience living harmoniously and cooperatively. And then at the end of the week, they take it down and it disappears without a trace. One of the interesting things that I found at Burning Man was that they don't use money. It runs on a gift economy. There's no sponsorship, no advertising. And what I found is that when you remove something or you change the rules of human interaction, like just taking money out of the equation, created an experience that was so much richer. Because normally, like when you go into a shop, you hand over some cash, you get goods, you don't need to have a meaningful interaction. But at Burning Man, in order to access all those experiences, you literally have to tell your personal story and be interested in the stories of those around you. And I've ended up going to Burning Man about 8 or 9 times, and I even traveled around the world working on another documentary, trying to cover how this culture has expanded. And so to some extent, I feel I have learned a little bit about what the DNA of human cooperation is. It also has made me believe in the power of storytelling. At Burning Man, you hear so many stories of the impact that it has on people. I mean, for me, it was the single most life-changing experience of my life. And it has been for a lot of other people as well. But no one could produce any data or statistics on the social impact of this event. I talked to so many organizers who have tried to do this, and they couldn't. And at the end of the day, all you have is thousands and thousands of stories that have the power to inspire you. So when I'm thinking about what I'm trying to bring into this research project with Beyond, I don't have any experience with the quantitative aspects of research, but I do feel that I have some experience with qualitative aspects. And I really do believe in the power of storytelling. One of the things, one of the words that I'm allergic to a little these days is scalability. So I'm glad Justin mentioned it in his intro. I hear it a lot, and in the business world and nonprofit world, and I think it's only natural with the scale of the problems that we confront. We naturally want solutions that can help a lot of people in a short space of time. The thing about trying to make things scalable is that a solution in one context can't be used, copied wholesale, and applied to a different context. Every context is unique. And that's why I believe stories are so powerful, because stories are very rich. And from a story, a person can take what they can use and adapt it and apply it to their own lives. So I'm hoping to bring an aspect of storytelling into my work with the Workers Co-op and Sociocracy. I mean, it would be wonderful if at the end of this year, we actually got to the point where I could videotape a meeting of the women members of the co-op. And, it's, people can see for themselves actually how people can really effectively make decisions for themselves. I think one last thing I kind of want to talk about is I'm also uncomfortable with the label nonprofit. I mean, I know we're at a conference that's, entitled Transforming the Nonprofit Sector, but I just want to suggest some limitations of this term. I think it puts the sector permanently on a back foot because it is establishing something else, which is profit, as the norm and the standard by which everything else is measured. And I think it's actually the reverse. So I would actually rather call the sector the life-serving sector, because when I look at all the activities and the services that this sector provides, they're all life-serving. And a lot of them are things that you cannot buy with money. I mean, the value of inclusion, human connection, respect, appreciation, belonging, empathy. These things cannot be captured by profit or the metrics of profit. And if we look at our actual experience of life, when we are born into this world as a baby, we are actually the recipients of multiple gifts from the universe and our families and our mothers. Our first experience of life is that we are completely helpless beings. And for many, many years after that, we continue to be helpless. We do nothing to deserve or earn the things that are given to us. They come to us simply because we need them. And so our first experience of life is that life is life-giving and that humans exist to give to each other, not to make profit. And it is only at a later stage that we become conditioned that actually humans are essentially selfish and that they need to be incentivized by profit in order to contribute to each other's welfare. So part of what I would like to do with my storytelling is to just try and tell a different story and show that when given the opportunity, humans have incredible potential to cooperate. So I'll actually just end there. I actually much prefer dialogue. So I would love to hear from people, and especially in keeping with the theme of what I've talked about, I would love to hear how anything that I've said might have moved you in ways that numbers or data would not have been able to. Thank you.
Thanks, Ansu. Ansu's such a great storyteller, and he also has very good taste. The stuff he likes are not just interesting concepts. They have inside them the germ of significant and meaningful social change. A worker co-op has inside the logic of worker ownership, which is a systemic solution to an oppressive economic system. Sociocracy has its germs, like he calls it, the DNA of human cooperation, right? Things that we've kind of lost touch with. And I think as he was speaking, and for the people who had the videos on, they were vigorously nodding their heads. So maybe instead of trying to capture the usual KPIs, maybe we should capture vigorous nodding of heads as a way of determining what is value from the things that we are sharing. And since Sociocracy is from the Netherlands, later we'll ask Bert whether he knows about Sociocracy and what he thinks of it later. But for now, let's go to a dialogue and a Q&A with Ansu and Biling. Does anybody have questions for them? You can either just raise your hands and unmute yourself, or you can type questions in the chat. Thanks, Hamida. Both presenters are very inspiring. Somebody else, I diary asked, wonder how NTUC encounters sociocracy. Would you like to elaborate?
Onsu, thank you very much for that presentation on sociocracy. Somewhere along the way, I had presented a question like this 6 years ago without any answers on the pedagogy of owned learning as opposed to pedagogy of ownership of learning, which I think what sociocracy was aiming towards. But I do wonder right at the very beginning whether the concept of failure was one guiding assessment factor, and two, the level of independence, the level of interdependence that I talked about with communities bearing their own destinies with little intervention. And finally, if NTUC, as I understand it, is a co-op, what model of cooperative is this as opposed to the sociocracy that you're advocating?
Yeah, no, I'm still not sure I entirely understand your question. Are you asking if Sociocracy is compatible with the NTUC model?
Well, I'm raising the question because sociocracy is evidently a kind of self-help combination of bottom-up, middle to top, where communities make their own decisions about how they run their lives and how they manage their lives, as opposed to corporate governance, which then determines that, okay, there are certain caveats in here, and this is what you can, this is what you cannot do. You know, in the Netherlands, it's quite clear where corporate governance is an issue more closely related to how communities raise themselves into governance, which is a very different model as I understand it here.
Yeah, no, definitely I would characterize Sociocracy as a decentralized form of organization. So rather than having power and decision-making concentrated at the top, you really try and distribute it so that, as much as possible, decisions are pushed out to the periphery. So for instance, an example of a bakery, if you had a separate circle for the pastry department, and a customer comes in and has a request for a different kind of cake, the pastry circle can actually, on its own, make the decision of whether they want to add that to the menu. They don't have to consult with management or anyone else because that is in their domain. So yeah, Sociocracy is not compatible with like a top-down approach, but it is compatible with a lot of different types of, I mean, you could still have a kind of corporate governance system. Like you could still have a board of directors that was, you could call that the mission circle, and the board of directors would be responsible for making sure that the entire organization is, still aligned with its stated mission. So I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
Well, and so let me take that question further, because COVID has actually brought about one of the most tied and most time-consuming and tiring problems, that of waste and managing waste. And I don't just mean waste of resources. I'm also talking about the ways in which corporate governance is piled up with people who are there who know nothing about understanding ergonomics. And all you have is a board of directors sitting down there doing stuff because they need to do stuff, because they've been appointed to do that. And at some point in time, a workforce that does not understand waste and waste of use, for example, then simply adds on to the problem. If you are talking about sociocracy and developing this idea of ergonomics and well-being, then there needs to be an understanding between corporate governance and pedagogy of ownership of learning from people at the bottom, that waste can be one of the things that gets in the way of sociocracy. Or let's say the determination of communities to own their own lives and contribute.
Thanks, Eugene, for that. Ian Yeo has a hand up. So what I'll do is whoever has a hand up gets to go next, and then I'll come to the questions in the chat next. Ian Yeo, please.
Hi, yeah, thanks Bileng and also Ansu for the wonderful presentation. So I'm now working in a startup charity, and I really want to ask, as a startup charity, we do have to go through the basic years of being a registered charity before we can apply, for example, as our IPC. So I guess from the discussion just now is that there is a place for ground out initiatives, but that would mean that it's hard to get funding. So how would you advise a startup charity, that's ground up to, when must we consider putting all the system in place so that we will potentially have funding as well? Because that is the current system. You do need a good system in terms of accountability, finance, and a track record in order to expand your area of work. So how do we balance that, and what would your advice be from what you have seen?
Sure, Bileng, any response?
I don't think I have any particular advice. So maybe Bileng, if you had.
Okay, so let me try. I think for me, I shared about the three do no harm questions. Yeah, there is a space for community. There's a space of the with space, and there's also the space for institutions. So I think some of what you say as a startup organization belongs to the institutional space. So in the institutional space, there are certain processes and certain requirements. So that is one space, and that space currently in Singapore does allow you to access certain funds and opportunities as well. But to me, it is therefore so important that we do not see funding only for that the institutional space. If at all, what I'm hoping to encourage is to see that it is legitimate and important to fund the space that's in the number 1 and the number 2. Yeah. And therefore, that's why I'm thinking that instead of all going into, setting up organizations and social services, would some of this be better used to support community initiatives? Yeah. So I think increasingly, I know some organizations that actually set aside funds to support this, but they are not prolific enough today to be able to encourage, and that's why the big climate to support the space where community can do initiatives that they can drive and own, Yeah, and typically people are very concerned about giving money to that space, as if like, that there won't be accountability and that money will be badly used. So we start from a place of mistrust, yeah. But my personal experience, when I take the risk of trusting, because I think it's my problem if I don't trust, yeah, it's my problem if I cannot trust. But when I take the position to trust, I see mutual accountability happening within of this kind of informal groups. So it's not true that informal groups are chaotic, they do anything they want, they cannot self-govern. People evolve their own ways of governance, within that informal groups, and they hold each other accountable. So they set up certain groups for a certain purpose, certain people commit to do certain things, and when certain people don't, they have their own processes to hold each other accountable. So I think we are probably too used to a certain framework about accountability that's top-down, such that we may have unwittingly, I think, sort of move ourselves more and more towards distrusting or mistrusting, community initiatives.
I wanted to pick up a question from Matilda, but kind of modify it a little bit. I think the spirit of it is, what the question being asked is, are there ways for initiatives, or if Bilang is doing a community initiative, for it to be 100% participatory? And I suppose then the spirit of that question is, to what extent is it necessary to always include the community as fully as possible under all conditions, and is that a good thing? And under what conditions is it okay to run ahead first and bring the community along with you? Does maybe Bilang and then maybe Ansu can kind of talk about it in the context of sociocracy. Does sociocracy allow actually 100% community participation?
Maybe firstly, I would need to understand why we need 100%. Yeah, why does community means 100% of people must all be involved? I think community is, like you said, small is beautiful. It allows for small groups to form, each, doing things that contribute to community well-being based on their motivation. So for me, what I do is usually I try to start off by trying to find out from the community what they care about in a community, what they are motivated to act on. So these are things that is my first question when I found. And these are things that when you find that, and you ask them after that, oh, they care about this playground being very dangerous. Many children have gotten, accidents and all that. And the next question is, are there people like you, other mothers and other grandparents who care like you about this, that you think, that can be brought together? And when that happens and that is possible, then this is starting where the community can do what they want to do, and this is a space that we can let the community do the self-driving and all that, with us playing a supportive role, coming in maybe in areas when they need it. For example, when they need to sort of write to town council and they need a kind of legitimate platform, and then that's where the weave space can come in. Yeah. But there are also occasions where we go around discovering, and then some groups are going on, they're doing fine. We connect with them to see, to bear in mind opportunities where we can stand together, on things for the community. If not, we're happy to be just good friends with them, Like we had a community garden, run by a few uncles and all that. And because of the friendship, they bring, spices, they bring pandan leaves and all that to when they hear that we are, when some other residents wants to do this little sort of lunch for the seniors in the neighborhood. So this kind of thing happens spontaneously. There are also areas where where it could actually be something that that they may need a little bit of catalyst. Yeah, they may need some kind of support going. Yeah. So for example, the idea of they some of them said, I've gone to learn about how to use the Zoom, how to WhatsApp and all that kind of thing. And now I cannot see my grandchildren. I really need that. And I've gone, but I still find that the class is too big. I need one-to-one and all that kind of thing. And they say, can we do something like that? And I say, are there other seniors who are also equally keen about this? And they say yes, but they feel that they can't do it alone on their own. So these are things that you can go into a space of, where you initiate, where professionals come in and step in areas where the community, wants you to step in. So I guess the long-winded answer here is that the first and foremost, go discover what people care about. Yeah, and then in areas that you feel you need to be a catalyst, I mean, it's okay to be a catalyst as long as we're always very mindful that to start with what they are strong in. Yeah, So that's all. So otherwise, it will be something we care about and only professionals can do.
Thanks, Biling. Ansu, any thoughts on whether Sociocracy actually allows full participation from the members of the organization?
Yeah, so participation is something I really believe in. One of the principles at Burning Man is no one is a spectator. Everyone participates. So even for me as a researcher, I'm not a neutral observer. Like, I am open to being changed or transformed by the experience. So I am participating, and we want everyone else to participate. But I think in my experience, it's also important to meet people where they are. So even the idea of participation can be very scary or new for some people. And I'm trying to introduce Sociocracy with a light touch. Like, it's not something that I want. It's not a model that I want to force on anyone. It really has to be welcome by them. And so if you're noticing that someone doesn't want to speak up, it's fine, right? I mean, you just give them time. And I think actually, someone else asked, I think Vincent asked about like what the experience of being a worker in a worker co-op is like. And I think it really is like a mindset that we all struggle with. And so it's a personal journey for me as well, kind of uncovering what the obstacles are for us collectively to make this shift where we all, take equal accountability and participation. It's like we've been conditioned, I feel, by generations and generations of dominance systems. And so even when you open up the doors of participation, I think a lot of us are still conditioned by internal systems of hierarchy where a lot of us are uncomfortable with freedom. We want someone else to tell us what to do. And so like what Biling said earlier, like a lot of this work needs a lot of time. It's like planting trees. And so I think 100% participation or that vision is not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a process.
Thanks, Ansu. And Vincent's from a good space. So that's Singapore's first social change co-op. And there are interesting cases whereby cooperatives are set up to provide social service even. So that's something we could consider. Let's see. Vincent also asked for examples of what it would be like to be an experience of being a worker in a worker co-op. So I mean, and of course Eugene mentioned NTUC, and I'm thinking NTUC Fair Price, the people who work in NTUC Fair Price, the cashiers and all that. That's a consumer co-op. That's different from a worker-owned co-op. So it'd be kind of interesting to consider whether the cooperatives here in Singapore can move towards that. Vincent, would you like to say a bit more about AGS perhaps?
Oh yeah, thanks Justin, and also thanks Ansu and Diling for your sharing. Yeah, I was quite curious because we kind of formed a cooperative of change makers in Singapore after hearing some of the challenges that change makers faced. I think Ian mentioned earlier as well. So I think one of the things that we've been having a lot of difficulty is this idea of like shared ownership that you mentioned, and also participatory decision making. So I was just curious to, like, if I'm a worker in a worker-owned co-op, then what is a day in my life like? Like, what kind of decisions do I get to make, and how does that happen? Yeah, so just curious.
So yeah, I mean, you know, it could be a very long answer. I mean, there's so many different dimensions to that. You know, on the one hand, that, you know, worker co-op could actually make the decision to appoint someone a manager. And so for like day-to-day operations, you empower that manager to just make decisions in the conventional way. But then, you know, they might meet occasionally, like once every 2 months, to establish broader policies more democratically. You know, whether it's, you know, I mean, some radical examples would be to actually gather together to discuss everyone's salaries transparently. I think some of those are some of the more interesting, you know, experiments. And I think the general experience, I think that the essence of what I'm trying to go for is that everyone's voice, like everyone feels their voice is heard. I mean, imagine just subjectively, like how you feel when you're in a gathering like this and you don't have the opportunity to speak up. Or if you actually create a culture where you invite even introverts to share, right? So I mean, that's the kind of experience that I'm interested in fostering.
I want to go back to a question that Denise posed. She said, how can we encourage our funders to accept non-traditional outcomes instead of quantitative measures? But before I get you to respond to that, I would like to understand from Bilay and Ansu. So Ansu already said, you know, if he could measure what's meaningful, he would video the conversations that the women are having, right? Bilay, if you could, if it didn't matter to the funders how you measured the change that you were making or the impact that you were making, what ways would you choose to account for what difference you're making?
I mentioned earlier about learning conversations. Yeah, so learning conversations are different compared to focus group discussion, for example, in its posturing. It's important to start off learning conversations from the position of discovery, inquiry, and curiosity. Yeah, rather than the learning conversation is one where you bring a group of people together, a community. So say, you know, if I'm curious about finding out how did this uncle started the garden, how he managed to get so many people coming to the garden for so long, and how he managed to you know, from a garden then become one where, you know, when people come, they also share food and yeah, and they bring, you know, and then the fishmonger bring extra fish, and then he'll cut it up and then he'll distribute to the neighbors. How did a process like this happen in the neighborhood? And this is real. I'm sharing something really real that happens in Kyo, right? Started by this uncle, and now he's got a group of people, and formally, informally, they've got a lot of these connections. So I will probably approach Uncle Jimmy and ask Uncle Jimmy, you know, if I am curious to find out how this whole thing got started, how do you sustain, how you keep it going, and how it seems to be growing in numbers as well. And then if you can bring a few people and we talk over tea, you know, and those yeah, with permission to and in his garden, and with permission to you know, Flum if he agrees. If not, then we will get someone to help document the process. Yeah, but essentially it will be curiosity questions. How did he get started? When did he get started? You know, who started? You know, and just basically to understand that whole process. And in the process, who comes? The people's stories will come into the picture, right? And how that particular relationship through the garden spun off to other possibilities, right? And how that has transformed or impacted a person's life. So all this, we can document and capture it down. So maybe if I can illustrate with a real example that I personally experienced through the garden. So in a garden, we have people from all walks of life. They come together because they love gardening, they love plants, and they share and exchange ideas and all that kind of thing. They get excited when you see the little babies of little, fruits budding and all that. But it is more than just the gardening. It brings together a group of people that typically just pass each other by. They lived together for 40 years, but they didn't know each other until they were part of the garden. Yeah. And then it also brings people from all walks of life. So what I love is that it breaks the stratification. Yeah, it brings people from the landed property together with the people who live in the rental blocks, and a whole big group of people come together with very different life experience, but sharing and exchanging each other's life stories. So in a garden, there's this guy who is really important to the garden because he's such a good handyman, right? And he's the one who set up the racks and do whatever the other seniors finds it too tough to do. In the garden is also a very wise gentleman who lives in a landed estate, and the two of this unlikely pair struck up and become very good friends, right? And partly because this gentleman who lives in a private estate will ask him to go over to his place to help also with his personal garden at home, with racks and some of this handiwork. And so they really create this trust and relationship that wouldn't have happened, in most circumstances because of the different world they live in. Then this gentleman, who is a good handyman, he was a bankrupt. He lives in a rental estate. He was a bankrupt, and he was trying very hard to get out of his bankruptcy. And he's been paying, and now is just the amount, and he's got this possibility of restarting his business. But there was still a certain sum. And without second word, this uncle from the landed estate said, I'm going to come up with a certain sum. The rest of us all chip in, but the uncle is the one with the deep pocket, so he came up the most. But everyone in the garden group chip in, and in the end, he cleared his bankruptcy. And today he's his own business owner of his very small pest control business. Now, that these are impact in people's lives that you can't capture with quantitative sometimes. But when you follow a group, you understand, you follow the lives of the people, the connections, and how these connections, create impact both to the individual as well as the group life. For example, the garden, many of them said, oh, my health has improved tremendously, because my social life is so much better. My physical health actually improved a lot. So these are things that, I would capture through conversations, learning conversations, and stories, documentation of stories.
Thanks, Bee-Ling and Ansu. We really have to move on.
Sorry,
to
can
the
I
next.
just ask the question? Who owns that garden?
This one was started by the citizens. It was actually it was
Whose real estate is this?
Sorry?
Whose real estate is this garden?
This is in the Ang Mo Kio area. It was actually initially offered by the RC. Yeah, right. But a group of residents
under the purview of someone else who's managing the real estate.
But in the end now, it's not under the RC. The residents has taken over.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
We really have to move on. Thank you, Bee-Ling and Ansu, for that. And I would have liked for a funder to respond to, if Bee-Ling and Ansu sends you videos and stories of this together with some KPI, would you accept it? What would your response to that be? But if we have time, maybe we'll hear from some grant maker later on. Now let's move on to so thanks, Bee-Ling and Ansu, for this segment.